But I would like to open our meeting. This is the meeting of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. Welcome everybody who is attending. My name is Cheryl Crisp and I'll be chairing today's meeting. Just to explain, and we'll do our housekeeping before we begin, the meeting was due to be held in person at Victoria University in Wellington. But due to the increase in COVID and the exposure of some of the meeting participants to the virus, we felt that it was necessary for the safety of all those attending to change it to an online meeting, just to ensure that nobody who is in the Victoria University room at the moment has been exposed as far as we know. So for those who didn't receive the notification of the change format and have arrived at the original meeting room, you will be able to access the televised meeting from there. So if there's been any inconvenience caused, then our apologies. Today we will be presenting two speakers. They will deliver their remarks to the meeting, and they are Boddy from Australia and Tom Peters. After they deliver their remarks, we will open up for questions and discussion. Some 8 days ago now, on Sunday, November the 5th, the SEP in Australia held a meeting such as this: Stop Israel's Genocide against Gaza. At the time of that meeting, there were less than 10,000 Palestinians who had been killed in the bombing by Israel of Gaza. Today, there are more than 11,100. That is far more than 1,000 dead in 1 week, and that is without doubt a vast understatement, as medics are now unable to reach the areas bombed by Israel. So the Palestinian Health Ministry can't update the death toll. There is no question millions of people throughout the world are stunned by the ferocity and barbarism that has unfolded in real time before their very eyes. Never in their lifetime have they witnessed anything of the sort, and people are rightly horrified and appalled by these events. The onslaught by Israel against Gaza is certainly not the first war crime that has been perpetrated by imperialism since World War II. But unlike others, where those perpetrating such atrocities have attempted to deny, to obfuscate, to justify, to cite defence, what characterises Israel's response is utter disdain and contempt for the fate and lives of the more than 2 million people trapped in this nightmare. That journalists, UN refugee workers, health workers are targeted is treated as a non-event. The bombing of hospitals has become a feature of this war. Doctors in Al-Shifa hospitals surrounded by Israeli tanks and subjected to non-stop bombardment, described as slow-motion death, the fate of the premature babies whose humidicribs shut down due to lack of power and bombing. Israeli snipers shot patients in their beds and health workers on the wards. In many ways, the shock of the Israeli crimes has been magnified by the support for those crimes by virtually every imperialist government worldwide. This includes the Labor government of Anthony Albanese in Australia and what is left of the tatters, which was the New Zealand Labor government of Jacinda Ardern and Chris Hipkins after the October 14 elections. As there is still no government in your country a month after the vote, Hipkins and the non-entity leader of National, Chris Luxon, who won only because they lost fewer votes than Labor, have pledged $5 million in humanitarian aid. As this is to be divided between the Palestinians and Israel, one gets a sense of the nature of the political establishment in New Zealand. In fact, quite frankly, the New Zealand rich would spend more on their swimming pools than $5 million. The newly minted Dame Jacinda Ardern has said not one word about the slaughter being carried out in Gaza, which her party and her government support. But millions of ordinary people refuse to be silent. In fact, the atrocities being carried out in Israel are compelling people all over the world to make a stand. They tell us at protests, at vigils, at demonstrations, and in interviews that they feel that they have no other duty but to oppose this, and this is an entirely correct response. However, as the protests grow, the bombardment intensifies. And as the protests grow, the coverage in every single media outlet reduces. London, with estimates of up to 1 million people, was given almost no coverage in the Australian media, and neither were the largest marches that had been held to date in Sydney and Melbourne. This is not because there are more important issues to cover, but it is to suppress dissent and opposition. While 60,000 people in Sydney marched, which is the largest demonstration in the last 5 weeks in support of the Palestinians, it is given far less coverage than the 1,000 or so supporters of Israel who met in the morning of yesterday, last Sunday, and who hailed Netanyahu's war against the people of Palestine. Millions of people are asking, how did the world get to this point? It is an important question, and it must be answered in order to understand how it is to be stopped. Because today, the Palestinians in Gaza are identified as the barrier to imperialist interests. Tomorrow, it is Iran, and the real targets are Russia and China. The task of our meeting is to discuss the answer to these questions, and most importantly, what political program is needed to stop the descent to world war and barbarism. Our first speaker today is Max Boddy. Max is the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP in Australia. He writes for the World Socialist website and plays a leading role in the fight to build the party in the working class and amongst youth. I'm very pleased to introduce him to this meeting.
Thank you, Comrade Cheryl. What is being carried out against the Palestinians by the Netanyahu regime is a genocidal war. For more than 5 weeks, there have been unending images on social media of neighbourhoods, hospitals and refugee camps being flattened. Each week, the barbarity escalates. The Israeli regime and military use the language of extermination, describing the Palestinians as animals. What is being enacted is the culmination of the Zionist regime's final solution of the Palestinian question. Now, last week, November 9th, marked the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht. That is the term used for a series of pogroms, violent riots aimed at ethnic cleansing, organised by the Nazi Party in Germany in 1938. Over 1,400 synagogues were burnt down, Jewish businesses destroyed, homes looted, people attacked, and cemeteries desecrated. Around 30,000 Jews were imprisoned in concentration camps and around 1,500 murdered. However, this anniversary has not been the occasion for the mass denouncing of the genocide being carried out in Gaza. Instead, it has been used to further the rallying cry for complete support for the Israeli regime. In Australia, a letter appeared last week, signed by a group of Holocaust survivors, which used the anniversary to claim that there is a new wave of anti-Semitism, that is, racist hostility to and prejudice against Jewish people, gripping the world. Just to quote from that letter, "The actions of Hamas are so familiar, so barbaric, yet instead of condemning this, the response across the globe is a shameful spike in anti-Semitism. In the present situation, the term anti-Semitism has taken on an entirely new meaning. The Israeli regime, the ruling classes of the world, and their supporters in the media and academia insist that anti-Zionism, that is, opposition to Israel, its actions, and reactionary nationalist ideology, is anti-Semitism. That is to claim that Zionism is inseparable from the Jewish religion and ethnicity. This assertion, as an historical examination reveals, is a big lie. But every lie plays a very definite social and political role, as it does in this case. The claim that Zionism is equivalent to Judaism has become the ideological rallying cry for imperialist reaction around the world. It has been used to back the Israeli genocide and to seek to ban and suppress demonstrations in support of the Palestinians. The aim is to crush democratic rights on the grounds that any organization opposed to Israel's bombardment is akin to anti-Semitic hate speech. So how is it possible that Holocaust survivors, when faced with genocide being carried out against the Palestinians, are using the anniversary of Kristallnacht to effectively denounce mass protests against the war? In order to understand and grasp this question, and the full meaning of the horrific genocide and its backing by capitalist governments worldwide, it is necessary to understand the nature of Zionism and its historical emergence. One must say, first of all, that the claim of the equivalency of Zionism with all its crimes and Judaism is a monstrous slander against the Jewish people. Zionism is not a religious movement, but a political one, with definite political aims and historical origins. From its foundations, the Zionist project was based on a reactionary nationalist ideology and program. It emerged in the aftermath of a series of pogroms against the Jewish population in Russia from 1881 to 1882. The Russian Tsarist regime was beset by a series of growing contradictions and launched a series of attacks on the Jewish population as an attempt to divert the anger of the population in a racial direction. The term pogrom has its origins there. This had a dramatic impact on Jewish thought. It escalated a turn by significant sections of Jewish youth and intellectuals towards socialism. They related the phenomena of anti-Semitism, which became increasingly virulent in the last decades of the 19th century, to capitalism. They saw that the resolution of this phenomenon through the revolutionary transformation of society on a socialist basis, and that the oppression of the Jews could only be ended through the construction of a revolutionary leadership of the working class. The best representatives of the Jewish intelligentsia joined the revolutionary movement. This includes leading figures such as Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, and even stretching back to Karl Marx himself. Now, this did not go unnoticed by the ruling class in the West, who eagerly seized upon the rise of anti-Semitism in the East to use as a political and ideological weapon against the emerging working class and socialist movement. Karl Lueger was a mayor of Vienna from 1897 to 1910. He purposely exploited anti-Semitism to drive a wedge between the workers' movement and the discontented petty bourgeoisie. A keen student of Lueger was the young Adolf Hitler. As one of Hitler's earliest biographers, Konrad Haydn, wrote of Hitler, just to quote, "The great light dawned on him. Suddenly the Jewish question became clear. The labor movement did not repel him because it was led by Jews. The Jews repelled him because they led the labor movement. But one thing is certain. It was not Rothschild the capitalist, but Karl Marx the socialist who kindled Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism." Above all, Hitler's hatred of the labor movement was because it was based on internationalism and equality for all people. Again, as Haydn wrote, quote, "One of Hitler's most characteristic reproaches to the labor movement is that in Austria it had fought for equal rights for all to the detriment of the master race chosen by God," end quote. The use of pogroms and the growth of anti-Semitism was to produce another political movement, the establishment of Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland, the foundations for which was laid by Theodor Herzl in 1897. It was established on a deeply pessimistic and reactionary nationalist perspective that anti-Semitism was not a product of society and therefore could be overcome by transforming society. Rather, it was argued, anti-Semitism was embodied in the very foundations of the human psyche and was of a permanent and supra-historical character and could not be ended. Critical to understanding Zionism is understanding that it directly opposed the international solidarity of the working class as the path to the liberation of the Jews. Instead, the movement sought allies with one reactionary power after another, as an open letter written in 1944 to a conference of the British Labour Party by Trotskyists in Palestine explained, to quote, "During its whole history, Zionism has always supported the reactionary forces of the world. Dr. Herzl, founder of Zionism, made a deal with the Tsarist minister Pleva, organizer of the pogroms against the Jews in Kishinev, to the effect that the Zionist movement be used as a lever against the Jewish socialists, in return for which Pleva would use his influence with the Turkish Sultan to obtain a charter for Zionism on Palestine." The anti-socialist nature of Zionism was recognized by other imperialist reactionaries who saw it as an antidote to the international socialist movement. As the long-time servant of British imperialism Winston Churchill said in 1920, quote, "The struggle which is now beginning between the Zionists and the Bolshevik Jews is little less than a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people," end quote. From the beginning, the establishment of a Zionist state, which would eventually become Israel, was only viable to the extent that it could serve imperialist interests as a non-Arab Jewish state in the Middle East. This has been the perspective on which Zionism has rested. For the first 40 years of the 20th century, the strategy was to seek an alliance with British imperialism. Following the Second World War and the collapse of the preeminence of Britain, the Zionists sought out other allies, eventually being recognized by the United States, which had emerged from the war as the global imperialist power. The establishment of Israel in 1948 was a tragedy not only for the Palestinians, but for the Jewish people as well. Its foundation was the direct result of the massive defeat of the working class in the 1920s and 30s by the Stalinists and social democracy, resulting in the coming to power of Hitler and the Nazi Party. To understand this, we must return to one of the most significant events of world history, the Russian Revolution of October 17, in which the working class, led by the Bolshevik Party, overthrew the capitalist provisional government and established the first workers' state. The strategic perspective and basis of the Russian Revolution was that it was to be the opening shot of the world socialist revolution. The fate of the Soviet state in Russia depended upon the extension of the revolution beyond the borders of Russia, above all into the advanced capitalist centers of Western Europe and North America. However, the Russian Revolution did not extend. That was not because the objective conditions did not exist for revolution in the advanced capitalist countries, as countless historians have claimed. The decisive factor in the defeats of the revolutionary struggles of workers in the advanced capitalist countries was that a revolutionary party of a Bolshevik type did not exist and was only in the process of formation. This had a profound impact on the outcome of the revolutionary struggles in Germany and Europe between 1918 and 1923, which ended in failure and counter-revolution. This meant that the first workers' state in Russia, which prior to the revolution was an economically backward country with a major and majority peasant population, found itself isolated politically and economically. It was surrounded by hostile imperialist powers who backed a devastating 3-year civil war in the country. These factors contributed to the isolation of the Soviet state and led to the emergence of a rising bureaucracy, an apparatus which found its leadership in Joseph Stalin. Stalinism was a nationalist backlash against the October Revolution. In 1924, he presented the perspective of socialism in one country, which was adopted by the Russian Communist Party. This was the complete opposite to the program of World Socialist Revolution. While Stalinism was victorious, it was not inevitable. There was a Marxist alternative, Trotskyism. Had it been victorious, the world would have been a very different place today. And the struggles between Trotskyism and Stalinism was the most consequential of the 20th century, and one can say reaching into the 21st. This year marks the centenary of the founding of the left opposition led by Leon Trotsky. Its founding document, the Declaration of the 46, was submitted to the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party on October 15, 1923. The primary struggle of the left opposition was a defense of socialist internationalism and the strategy of world socialist revolution. It fought against the reactionary nationalist anti-Marxism of Stalinism, which came to dominate the workers' movement on the false premise that it represented the continuity of the Russian Revolution. The issues that were fought out between these two political tendencies in the 1920s and 30s had a profound impact on the historical outcomes that determine what we see today. The defeat of Trotsky and the left opposition in Russia and the victory of Stalinism had a catastrophic impact on the outcome of the class struggle in Germany when, in 1933, the Nazi regime came to power. The victory of Hitler was not preordained. There existed a powerful working class movement that could have swept the fascists aside. Trotsky called for a united front of social democratic and communist parties, the two mass parties of the German working class, to defeat the Nazi Party. He warned that the victory of Nazism would be a global catastrophe which would see the annihilation of the European Jewry. These warnings were ignored. The Stalinist Comintern refused to wage a fight against fascism, instead instigating an ultra-left turn, labelling social democracy as social fascists. This split the working class and allowed Hitler to come to power without a shot being fired. This was the greatest defeat of the working class in history. The Nazis then obliterated the workers' organisations and placed their leaders and members in concentration camps. Now, Zionism grew and developed because of this defeat. The smashing up of the German working class then led to World War II and the Holocaust, setting in train a series of events that function in the political situation today. Without the victory of Hitler and fascism, there would never have been a mass Zionist movement or a mass migration of Jews to Palestine. In the previous period, most Jews were assimilationists. They wanted to enter society, not a Jewish homeland. In response to the pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th century, they wanted to go to the United States and Canada, not to Palestine. Obviously, the most politically conscious Jewish intellectuals, workers, and students turned to the socialist movement, and Zionism was a marginal political movement. However, the defeat in Germany changed all of this. The horrors of the Holocaust, the mass displacement of the Jewish population, coupled with a political demoralization and loss of confidence in the perspective of socialism, caused the reactionary perspective of Zionism to gain significant ground. Moreover, all the major capitalist powers, most notably the US, Canada, and the European countries, who today claim to have a profound sympathy for the Jews, closed their borders during and following the Second World War. This blocked hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, resulting in many thousands perishing in concentration camps. But the Zionist project was to lead to a disaster for the Jewish people themselves, as Trotsky had warned in 1940. It was a bloody trap, because whatever the attempts by left-wing Zionists to give it socialist colorations, it rested on two reactionary foundations. First, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from their land by means of murder and terror. Second, by its open and increasing collaboration with imperialism as a garrison state in the Middle East, from where the supplies of oil in the post-World War II period became crucial. As United States President Joe Biden put it recently, the US had made an investment in the state of Israel. Had it not emerged, it would have been necessary to invent it. The product of Israel's nationalist foundations and its role as a gendarme for imperialism has meant the Israeli state has been expansionist from its very establishment, with a now 75-year history of violent oppression. Zionism is the most virulent form of imperialist nationalism, which forms the basis in the final analysis of all capitalist governance. But experiences of this past week demonstrate that national programs are not only a dead end for the Jewish working class, but the Palestinians as well. While hellfire has been raining down on Gaza for nearly a month, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, met with the US Secretary of State and war criminal Antony Blinken. The declared purpose for the talks was not to denounce the US's part in the genocide, but to discuss the possible role of the Palestinian Authority in running Gaza once Hamas had been removed from power. Abbas had been offered, by the hand of death, the role as the policeman for Gaza, as it had been on the West Bank, against the Palestinian people on behalf of Israel and US imperialism. Now, the shamelessness of Abbas's meeting demonstrates the bankruptcy of the nationalist project of building a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, the so-called two-state solution. It proves once again that such a state is only possible by means of oppressing the Palestinians. The liberation of the Palestinian people can never be achieved via an abortion of a nation state brokered by imperialism. Such a conception has its origins not only in the Fatah-based Palestinian Authority, but in the betrayals carried out by the bourgeois nationalist Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO. Established in 1964, the PLO was a secular movement that, from its inception, represented the nationalist aspirations of an exiled Palestinian bourgeoisie. It was both unable and unwilling to make any genuine appeal to the Arab working class and oppressed masses. Instead, it depended on the reactionary Arab bourgeois regimes who all collaborated and continue to collaborate today in Israel's persecution of the Palestinians. This perspective of the PLO eventually led to the Oslo Accords in September 1993. Promoted as a step towards a peace process, in reality, the Accords provided a cover for unrelenting Israeli aggression over the last 3 decades. This has now culminated in the Zionist state's final solution: the removal, the murderous bombardment, and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people recall nothing so much as the Holocaust, an industrial state carrying out the mass murder of an entire population. The resistance of the Palestinians to this 75-year war has not been broken. However, the liberation of the Palestinian people and the true resolution of the so-called Jewish question can never be achieved on the basis of national programs. The genocidal war of the Zionists on the one hand and the unchained negotiations for power by the Palestinian Authority on the other tell us this. It is only the working class, united across national and religious boundaries in a common struggle against imperialism, that can put an end to oppression, poverty, ethnic cleansing, and war. This perspective must be taken up by the masses of workers and youth who are entering the streets in their millions around the world opposing this genocide. What is required is a program that enables this movement to develop an understanding of its essential tasks. That is, the program of international socialism that animated and guided the October Revolution of 1917, opening the way for a new chapter in mankind's development. This perspective was carried forward by the left opposition and then the Fourth International, founded by Leon Trotsky in 1938, and which today is advanced only by the International Committee of the Fourth International, our party. I encourage all of you attending today to strongly consider joining our movement and begin your critical education in these essential historical questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. Look, I know there will be many questions arising from Max's comments and remarks. I know in Sydney, when he spoke and raised some of the same issues that he has presented here, it was greeted with enormous appreciation, because these issues are never discussed. They're certainly not discussed or taught in schools. They're certainly not taught in universities. So if there's any questions at all, that will be available for discussion and answers after our next speaker, who is, and I'm sure I don't need to really introduce him that much, because I know he's known very well to you all, Tom Peters. He is in charge of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. He writes extensively for the World Socialist website. Tom writes on the situation facing the working class in New Zealand, the economic situation. He writes on political, ideological, and historical questions. And Tom will be delivering the main report and also our last report. And I'm very pleased and proud to introduce him to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Cheryl, for that introduction. And I'm very pleased to be able to speak to all of you, those of you in Wellington. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today, but it is great to be able to address an international audience. We have people joining from different parts of New Zealand as well as in Australia. I think we have people in Christchurch and Nelson, and someone in the United States, I believe. So very warm welcome to all of you. I think, well, what the world is witnessing in Gaza, Israel's unrestrained mass murder of tens of thousands of people, with the full support of the United States and all of its allies, is the most stark and horrifying manifestation of what is an existential crisis of the global capitalist system. And unless it is prevented by a movement of the international working class, we are in the opening stages of a third world war, which poses enormous dangers to the world's population. In order to plunder vast wealth and resources from Russia, China, and the Middle East, Washington and its allies will stop at nothing, including nuclear war and the destruction of tens or hundreds of millions of lives. Last year, the US and NATO instigated a bloody war with Russia over Ukraine, which is continuing and has already cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and is now triggering growing opposition within Ukraine. The Biden administration is now threatening Iran. It's positioned warships and tens of thousands of troops in the Middle East. Meanwhile, as one BBC headline put it this week, the US is quietly arming Taiwan to the teeth with more than $14 billion worth of military equipment, with the clear aim of using Taiwan in the same way that they have used Ukraine to provoke war with another nuclear-armed power, China. In this context, the endorsement of Israel's atrocities by every imperialist government, including Australia and New Zealand, must be taken as a sharp warning of what they are also planning and prepared to do anywhere in the world to defend their interests. What Israel is carrying out against the people of Gaza recalls the crimes of the Nazis. 2.3 million people crammed into an open-air prison not much bigger than Wellington or Christchurch are being unrelentingly bombed, shelled, and starved. When Israel's heritage minister, the far-right minister Eliyahu, said a week ago that dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza was one option, he was only spelling out the policy of the Netanyahu regime, which has dropped more than 30,000 tons of explosives on the Gaza Strip in little more than a month, which is the equivalent of 2 Hiroshima bombs. More than 11,000 civilians have been killed, as Cheryl said, including more than 4,600 children, and these figures are at least 3 days old, and 30,000 have been wounded. The toll is increasing as we speak, with an estimated 1 child dying every 10 minutes. And many more will perish because of the lack of water and the cut-off of electricity to hospitals. More than 220,000 residential units have been damaged and 40,000 completely destroyed, according to the last count. Israel has bombed hospitals, schools, churches, mosques, UN facilities, refugee camps. Almost 200 health workers are confirmed to have been killed, more than 100 UN employees, and almost 50 journalists and media workers. The World Health Organization announced a couple of days ago it had verified more than 250 attacks on hospitals, clinics, patients, and ambulances. 2/3 of Gaza's hospitals are no longer able to function. The Al-Shifa hospital, with thousands of patients and displaced people, is surrounded by tanks and snipers, and inside the hospital, babies are dying because of power being cut off to incubators. Israel's plan is to expel the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and to kill those who can't or who won't leave. This same policy is being pursued in the West Bank, where fascist thugs armed by the Israeli state and protected by the military are terrorizing and murdering Palestinians and forcing them from their homes. In the past month, Israeli forces in the West Bank have killed at least 185 Palestinians and injured more than 2,000 and imprisoned 2,500, on top of many thousands who were already being detained. In the words of Craig McIver, who resigned as director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights last month, quote, "This is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase toward the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe are wholly complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are these governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving political and diplomatic cover for Israel's atrocities." End quote. As far as Washington is concerned, Israel can continue killing with total impunity. On Thursday, Joe Biden was asked, "Are Israel's retaliatory strikes working?" "Yes," he said, "they're working in the sense that they're hitting the targets they're seeking." And he added that there was no possibility of any ceasefire. Last Tuesday, New Zealand's Labour Party Prime Minister Chris Hipkins dismissed allegations that Israel had committed war crimes as, quote, speculation and, quote, hypothetical. He said that he couldn't make any judgment because, quote, obviously I'm not there. It's no wonder that Labour Party MP Phil Twyford was recently booed off the stage when he tried to address a protest in Auckland in support of the Palestinian people. This government, along with the United States, Britain, Australia, and many others, is openly supporting Israel's war crimes under the fake pretext that it is engaged in self-defense. It should be noted that propaganda from politicians and the media whitewashing and justifying genocide is itself a war crime according to international law. The actions of Israel are not the response to the October 7 uprising led by Hamas. It's very clear that the ethnic cleansing operation now underway had been planned for a long time. Netanyahu seized the opportunity to implement it, not least in order to deflect the mass opposition against his corrupt and extreme right-wing regime, which provoked mass protests earlier this year. What has been revealed is the real face of capitalism. The Israeli garrison state, founded through the dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians, can only resolve its deepening economic and political crisis by seizing more land and resources. The United States is supporting this murderous apartheid regime in order to strengthen its own interests in the Middle East against Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah and other groups. And the media dutifully portrays all of this as the defense of democracy. The reality is that the ruling class is shredding democracy and human rights, including within Israel and the imperialist countries themselves. And the same thing can be seen happening in Ukraine. Last week, the Zelensky regime, touted by the NATO powers as the spearhead of Western democracy against Russian despotism, cancelled the country's presidential elections due to be held next year. Ukraine is a far-right police state. Political activists who oppose the war or even who simply call for negotiations with Russia have been persecuted and imprisoned. The United States and NATO powers, which are supplying Ukraine with endless weapons, insist that the war must continue regardless of the cost in Ukrainian and Russian lives. A perspective published by the World Socialist website on Saturday, titled Israel's Genocide in Gaza and the Resurgence of Imperialist Barbarism, stated as follows, quote, "The events of the past month are radicalizing millions of people throughout the world, which has found expression in the mass demonstrations against Israel's genocide. The development of this movement requires an understanding of the underlying causes of the imperialist atrocity. The universal support by US and NATO for the homicidal actions of the Israeli regime is an extension and deepening of 30 years of unending war, spearheaded by the United States. US imperialism and NATO saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990-91 as an opportunity to utilize its unrivaled military force to reimpose shackles on the former colonial world. And over the past 30 years, the world has seen decades of war against Iraq, the NATO bombing and breakup of Yugoslavia, the decades of war against Afghanistan, following the 9/11 attacks, and Barack Obama's administration escalated these wars, as well as bombing Libya in 2011 and fomenting the bloody civil war in Syria. In 2014, Washington orchestrated a coup in Ukraine that installed a far-right anti-Russian regime, triggering Vladimir Putin's annexation of Crimea and paving the way for the eruption of all-out war. The geostrategic aims of the United States are nothing less than redivision of the world to establish unchallenged economic hegemony. This includes conquering large parts of the world which were cut off from direct imperialist colonization because of the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution and the anti-colonial movements following World War II. Imperialist war, as Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Russian Revolution, explained, is not just a policy that can be reversed by voting out politicians or placing pressure on them through protests. Imperialism and war are the inevitable products of capitalism. In the pamphlet Socialism and War, published in August 1915, Lenin wrote, quote, "Capitalism now finds the old national states too tight for it. Free trade and competition have been superseded by the striving for monopoly, for the seizure of territory, for the investment of capital, for the export of raw materials from them. Capitalism has developed the forces of production to such a degree that mankind is faced with the alternative of going over to socialism or of suffering years and even decades of armed struggle between the great powers for the artificial preservation of capitalism by means of colonies, monopolies, privileges, and national oppression of every kind." End quote. Those words, written during the barbarism of the First World War, speak directly to the situation facing the world today. The contradiction between the outmoded and reactionary nation-state system embodied in the Israeli state, perhaps more than anywhere else, and the global integration of the world economy has reached such intensity that it can't be resolved by it can only be resolved by the imperialist powers through military expansionism and conquest of new territories. The crisis of capitalism, however, is also giving rise to a revolutionary situation. The genocidal slaughter of Palestinians has triggered mass anti-war protests on a scale not seen in decades. These have united people of every nationality and religion, including large numbers of Jewish people. Millions of people can see what's happening in Gaza, and they do not believe the lies of the corporate media. Governments everywhere are being discredited and are resorting to smear campaigns and authoritarian methods against the protests. And there's a real element of desperation in this. As Cheryl said, as many as 800,000 people marched in London on Saturday in defiance of threats by the Tory government, whose Home Secretary Suella Braverman denounced the protesters, smearing them as hateful and anti-Semitic, and threatening, quote, further action in order to suppress the movement. In Germany, which is playing a central role in sending weapons to Israel, demonstrations have been banned or are subject to intensive police harassment and intimidation. Police officers are confiscating Palestinian flags and photographs of Palestinians who have been killed by Israel. And in the United States, the US House of Representatives voted this week to censure Democratic Representative Rashida Tlaib because of her factual statements that the US government is supporting Israel's genocide. We wrote on the World Socialist website, quote, the censure of Tlaib must be taken as a warning. The ruling class, desperate in the face of a growing mass movement, will employ any and all means to suppress popular opposition. But this is not a sign of strength, but of weakness. As we said, they're terrified that any comment, even by a member of Congress, could serve as a lighted match in the tinder of social opposition. And in this country, Prime Minister Hipkins, as well as the extreme right ACT leader David Seymour and most of the media, are now repeating the absurd lie that the chant "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," used by protests throughout the world, is somehow an anti-Semitic call for the extermination of the Jews in Israel. There are, in fact, as I said, many Jewish people who've joined the global protests, including the thousands who occupied Grand Central Station in New York, who denounced the Netanyahu regime that claims to be acting on behalf of all Jewish people. I'd like to just play a video that shows some of the violent methods that the Israeli state is using within Israel against anti-Zionist Jews in Jerusalem for the crime, in particular the crime of displaying Palestinian flags. And on Friday, a Jewish school teacher in Israel, a high school teacher, was arrested and thrown into prison, accused of supporting terrorism, because he pointed out that the war crimes committed by the IDF he pointed to the war crimes of the IDF and the historical oppression of the Palestinian people, and that the Hamas operation took place in this historical context. So I'll just play a very brief video of that. What these episodes, and there are many others, examples happening in Israel, show is that this is not a religious war. It's not about Arabs versus Jews. This is a war by the capitalist elite against the oppressed masses in Palestine and against the working class and all progressive forces, including within Israel, who dare to oppose this genocide. Everywhere, it's the same thing. The working class is being forced to pay for the wars in the Middle East, in Ukraine, the massive military buildup against China, through cuts to social services, attacks on living conditions, and on democratic rights. And this is the case in New Zealand as well. Labour and National agree that the military budget here has to increase from about currently 1.4% of GDP to at least 2% of GDP, even as they slash funding for dozens of state agencies, which will lead to thousands of job cuts and attacks on healthcare and other basic services. Plans are being made to drag New Zealand into what would be a devastating war involving nuclear-armed powers. And the position is sometimes raised that New Zealand is very far away and not really involved in any of these conflicts. That is really far from the case. New Zealand is not a bystander. It's an imperialist power in the Pacific region and deeply implicated in US warmongering against Russia and China and all throughout the world. We reported last week on the World Socialist website about Pine Gap, the spy base in Central Australia, which is part of the US-led Five Eyes intelligence network. This base is involved, according to a former analyst who worked there, in monitoring the Gaza Strip and surrounding areas with all of its resources and gathering intelligence assessed to be useful to Israel. And New Zealand is part of the same Five Eyes network. We know, thanks to the whistleblower Edward Snowden in 2015, that the GCSB and its Waihopai spy base conducts global surveillance, including intercepting communications across the Pacific, in South America, China, and other parts of Asia, as well as Pakistan, India, and Iran. And that was as of 2013. So, it's undoubtedly expanded since then. The outgoing Defence Minister, Andrew Little, spelled out in August that, quote, if conflict does break out in the South China Sea, where $20 billion of our exports flows through every year, we have a stake in that, and we may be called on to play a role should that conflict break out. We need to be equipped for that and prepared for it. This massive preparation for war cannot be done without escalating attacks on the working class. As I said, both its living standards to pay for the war and its basic rights, because democratic rights are incompatible with the descent into nuclear war, whether that's in Ukraine, Russia, Israel, or New Zealand. The political crisis in New Zealand, which Cheryl referred to, is directly related to how best to impose the crisis on the economic crisis on working people and the military spending bill. Labour was thrown out of office 1 month ago for presiding over increased poverty, a society where more than 1 in 5 children live in poverty, more than 100,000 people are homeless, and more than 1 in 10 people relies on food banks, and there is a total disaster in the public health system. Chris Hipkin's contemptuous dismissal of the suffering of the Palestinian people is reflected in the ruling elites and the Labour Party's attitude towards the working class in New Zealand. The fact that 1 month after the election there's no new government is because the extreme right-wing ACT, New Zealand First, and National are discussing behind closed doors how is the best way to impose the next round of austerity and ramping up the militarization of New Zealand society. As I said, a mass movement against war is erupting internationally and in New Zealand because working people in every part of the world see what's happening and realize that they have to do something. What everyone is asking is, what next? How must the fight against Israel's genocide be developed? There is a sense that protests, while they're absolutely necessary, are not enough by themselves. And this is correct. 20 years ago, the largest protests in history took place against the invasion of Iraq, but that did not prevent George Bush and his allies from launching the invasion that led to at least 1 million deaths and the destruction of an entire society. Those protests 20 years ago were subordinated to the Democratic Party, to making futile appeals to the United Nations or to the French government or other European governments to oppose the United States. And in New Zealand, the protests were largely led by the Greens and geared towards trying to pressure the Labour government, which, with the support of the pseudo-left Alliance Party, had sent troops into Afghanistan and then sent troops to Iraq on the orders of the United States. Pacifist appeals will not work. The only force that can stop a third world war is the organized revolutionary action of the working class against the source of war, which is the capitalist system. We support the call by the trade unions in Palestine for workers to block the shipment of war material to Israel. This has already been taken up by Belgian transport workers and workers at the port of Oakland. There have also been protests in Australia against shipments going to Israel. This has to be expanded massively, and the anti-war movement has to be fused with the emerging fight against austerity and wage cuts and other attacks on the working class. The international working class should mobilize in a political general strike, including shutting down all military support for Israel and ending ties with demands to end all ties with the US war machine. But this requires a fight against the trade union bureaucracies that currently have a stranglehold over the working class. The unions can no longer be described as organizations of working people. They've degenerated into the appendages of corporations and of the state, and frankly, they are actively supporting this genocidal war. In the United States, while Joe Biden has been in discussions about sending more weapons to Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan and plotting against Iran, he's been simultaneously holding almost daily meetings with union leaders, particularly in the auto industry, because those officials in the unions act as a police force on behalf of imperialism in an industry that is critical to the production of military equipment. Our party, the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, is fighting for workers to take power out of the hands of the corrupt pro-capitalist bureaucrats who run the unions. And I'd like to play a video now of posted on Friday by Will Lehman, who's an auto worker from Macungie, Pennsylvania, who stood as a candidate for president in the United Auto Workers Union election last year.
Last week, I issued a public demand that the UAW cease production at all facilities where members are producing equipment and weapons for the Israeli military's ongoing genocide against the people of Palestine. I demanded that workers receive full pay during shutdown and that salaries be paid out of the pockets of the weapons manufacturers who are profiting off of war crimes. Video of my demand went viral, revealing the overwhelming opposition of the international working class to the crimes Israel is currently committing, with full support of the U.S. government, the Biden administration, and both the Democratic and Republican parties. Hundreds of thousands of people viewed the statement, and thousands left supportive comments. In recent days, I have received messages of support from rank-and-file workers across the UAW and across the world supporting my call. UAW members are stepping forward. as evidenced by the courageous calls by UAW Local 2325, Bronx Public Defenders, and Local 2710, Columbia University graduate students, for all workers and young people to take action in defense of Palestine. But UAW President Shawn Fain has refused to respond. His actions, and the actions of the entire UAW leadership, has been to continue supporting Joe Biden and to keep production running as bombs and missiles made in the USA continue to rain down on the defenseless people of Gaza. I condemn this cowardly silence from the bureaucrats who run the UAW and all other major U.S. trade unions. If there is to be action, it must be organized and prepared by us, the rank and file, both in the UAW and beyond, on an international scale. Past anti-war movements, led by the privileged upper middle class, have been subsumed into the Democratic Party, the graveyard of social movements. This anti-war movement must be based in the working class, the social force capable of bringing imperialist war and capitalist exploitation to an end. Whether you are a UAW member or not, you can join the rank and file movement to unite workers against imperialism, the corporations, and the bought-off trade union bureaucracies. Sign up now at wsws.org/worker. Thank you.
Will Lehman won thousands of votes, 5,000 votes in the union election for president on a platform of taking power out of the hands of the bureaucracy and placing it in the hands of the rank and file. The UAW bureaucracy only remained in power because it sabotaged the election and engaging in massive voter suppression. But there is a rebellion among auto workers in the United States and workers more broadly. And there's an understanding, as Lehman says, if there is going to be any real fight against war, it has to be organized by the rank and file. We are calling for rank and file committees to be formed in every industry, independent of the trade unions, to unite workers against war. And above all, what workers need is a genuine socialist party. The stakes are incredibly high. The Second World War could only take place because of the betrayals carried out by the nationalist leaders of the working class, above all the Social Democrats and the Stalinists, the grave diggers of the Russian Revolution, who betrayed the fight for world socialism, and whose actions paved the way for Hitler to come to power in Germany and Franco in Spain. After World War II, the domination of the bourgeois nationalist movements, including those who falsely claim to represent the Palestinian masses, have led to one disaster after another. But there was and there is an alternative provided by Leon Trotsky and the Fourth International, which was founded in 1938 in response to the betrayals of the Stalinist-led Third International. And we urge all of you listening today to study this history, the history of the Trotskyist movement. The internationalist program, as I said earlier, fought for by Lenin and by Trotsky, is totally contemporary. Their diagnosis of the bankruptcy of capitalism and of the nation-state system, and their program for the unification of the international working class speaks directly to the catastrophic crisis that confronts us today. The eruption of the most barbaric forms of warfare, the endless pandemic that has been allowed to kill tens of millions of people, the threat of devastating climate change, mass poverty, and starvation. None of these issues can even begin to be addressed outside of the fight for the overthrow of capitalism and the socialist reorganization of the world. Society's wealth and resources must be taken out of the hands of the ruling class. The productive forces must be placed in common ownership and organized to address human needs, not to accumulate profits and to build bombs, warships, and nuclear weapons. We are living in a revolutionary period of history, in the sense that the same contradictions giving rise to war also create the conditions for revolutionary struggles that will increasingly be directed against capitalism. More and more people understand that nothing is going to be gained by voting for Labour or any of the capitalist parties. 6 years of a Labour Greens government in New Zealand, backed by the trade unions, has only worsened the crisis of social inequality and strengthened New Zealand's integration into the US war machine. And the same can be seen in every part of the world. But socialist revolution is not going to happen automatically or as an outcome of spontaneous anger among masses of people. The history of the 20th century shows that without the necessary political organization and leadership, the capitalist elite will always survive a revolutionary crisis, even if it has to destroy tens of millions of lives, impose dictatorial regimes, and make much of the planet uninhabitable. If that's what it takes to preserve the profit system, then that's what they will do. So everything depends on the decisions made by individuals who are being politicized by this war and are coming into political struggles internationally. And that includes everyone at this meeting today. And so we urge you all to join our fight to build the New Zealand section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution. And if I should add, if you're a student at Victoria University of Wellington, you can join our club, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, and fight to build it there. But make the decision to join our movement, study the history of the Trotskyist movement, and commit yourself to the fight for the socialist transformation of the world. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm sure for everybody who's listened to both reports, there is a huge amount that both speakers have gone through, have covered, and I'm sure there's questions arising from them. But while you're thinking about your questions, we would like to just present a brief video clip. Both speakers have highlighted what is a feature of the response to the situation in Gaza, and that has been the mass and growing protests that have been carried out throughout the world. I mean, from the United States, Germany, Britain, throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, New Zealand, and Australia. There is undoubtedly and increasingly growing attempts by governments to ban these protests, to put forward the libel that they are anti-Semitic because they oppose Israel. Our position is that these protests have a very profound and objective significance. It is the active interference of the masses into political life, and that, of course, presents for the ruling class an enormous danger, and hence the response, which is to attempt to censor, silence, and prevent these protests from taking place. So we will just show you now just a brief 90-second, I think it is, video of some of the protests which have developed over the last 5 weeks, and then we'll open up for any questions and discussion.
Biden, you can't hide! Biden, you can't hide! We charge you with genocide! We charge you with genocide! Genocide Joe! Genocide Joe!
Shame, shame, USA!
Shame, shame, Australia, shame! Shame, shame, Australia, shame! Shame, shame, Israel, shame! Shame, shame, Israel, shame!
The importance of those protests is certainly, as I said, the intervention of the masses, the interference of the masses into political life. The issue which has to be dealt with and really resolved is the political leadership, the political message which is being presented in those protests. So it's on those issues and the many others that Max and Tom have raised that we would like to open up for questions or comments. Well, while you're thinking, we could introduce you to some of the literature that is available. We have these 3 publications that are available through Mehring Books, and we would encourage everybody here to purchase either or all of these 3 publications, or to go to mehringbooks.com.au and view the literature that we have available. One of the major publications that we would like to present is Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. This publication was released earlier this year. It encompasses essays and lectures and letters by Comrade David North, the chairman of the World Socialist website, International Editorial Board, and was written over the past 40 years. Taken together, they really do give a comprehensive explanation as to why the legacy of Trotsky and the perspective of world socialist revolution that he personified is the only way forward for the working class today. Now, this publication is available for 39 New Zealand dollars plus postage, which I understand is around $6. The other publication that we have is Socialism and the Fight Against War. It's $5 Australian plus postage. I'm not sure what that is. I think the New Zealand dollar is fairly on parity. But it is a publication of particularly the statement, Socialism and the Fight Against War, but others as well, in 2016. And this took place after the Maidan coup in Ukraine, in which what became clear and what the International Committee analysed was a deepening threat of global war. It had been after 15 years of the United States war on terror, in which thousands, millions had been maimed and killed throughout the Middle East, and in which that was now being developed further abroad, in particular in opposition to China and Russia. So I would very much highlight that this pamphlet is available. It is, as I said, $5, which is very competitively priced. And you could buy it also in conjunction with the SEP's Statement of Principles, which is, as it says, the encapsulation of the essential principles of the socialist and revolutionary movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International. And it goes through and gives a summary of the analysis, the basic tenets of our movement, which is the basis for membership of the SEP, both here and also of the SEG in New Zealand. It is also $5. So if you bought them all together, it would be under $50. And I think it would be a very well worth buying such a number of publications. Now, we have a hand.
Thank you for your wonderful information about those books and the socialist thing, what you are. A lot of us probably came here today because there was a poster up saying "Stop Israel's Genocide Against Gaza." So, I mean, people have come here wanting to that have been shocked and horrified and would like to know what can we actually do. I mean, some of us might even be national voters. We might have different political opinions, but we're here united against the genocide in Gaza. What practical things can we do? I mean, for instance, I would have liked to have gone to that march had I known about it. but I didn't know about it. So I think there seems to be lots of disparate groups. Which one do you go to? You know, who's doing the march this year or this month? You know, we want some information about how we can actually physically help, you know, tune up, do stuff, you know, how can we actually help the situation? Who do we go to? What sort of doc go to find out when the next march is? I mean, that might not be important, but it shows that our leaders, what the popular feeling is.
Look, it's a question that, and actually numbers of those sorts of questions came up at our Sydney meeting as well, or our Australian meeting, more to the point. And I think there is another question, which is very much along the same lines as your own, from Jennifer. It says, for people feeling helpless right now and wanting to help in this situation as best as possible, what would be a good first step? So they're very similar questions and very good questions. If there's no others at the moment, I'll open up to Max and Tom, or I know there's other SEP members in the audience if they want to speak as well. But we'll open up for our two presenters at the moment if either of you want to answer those questions.
Well, I mean, yes, it is important that such questions are being raised, and I think you know, people want to be able to do something practical that will actually make a difference. That is. And there's an enormous sense of frustration, and we've recorded it in many of the interviews that we've published on the World Socialist website at all of the demonstrations around the world. So the question, what can we actually do, is totally valid. And as you said, I think you want information about physically when the next march is, and that is important. And there are groups in New Zealand that, pro-Palestinian organisations which have been advertising marches on social media, and particularly because there's a blackout of information in Stuff and New Zealand Herald and all the rest of the media. Many of these events actually, are very well attended, but they could perhaps be far greater in number if they were actually publicised and not blacked out in the way that the media is seeking to do. So there's a real, there's a real campaign by governments internationally to just, try and downplay, as I think Cheryl mentioned, the coverage in Australia is absolutely extraordinary. They have enormous marches taking place in the major cities, and it barely gets mentioned. I think the coverage today of the weekend's protests gives more space to the pro-Israel protests, which were pretty tiny by comparison. So there is a deliberate policy by the corporate media and politicians to really just keep people in the dark. And it's not working, because people now increasingly understand and are turning to alternative independent sources of information through social media and through publications such as the World Socialist website. So at a very practical level, in terms of answering your question, we are following the marches on social media, and they are happening in most parts of New Zealand and most parts of the world every weekend. And there are other events as well. I believe this evening there's an event in Wellington, in fact, in about 8:30 or 9. But but I guess the other point that the question raised, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but I believe you said, we want to know what we can actually do, and people have different opinions. There may even be National Party voters, but we're all against the genocide, and I guess what we are fighting for is political clarity, and that is actually the most important question. I think I tried to make that point in discussing the 2003, the failure of the protests against the Iraq War. It was not a failure of people not wanting to fight, or being too lazy to go to protests. Those were the biggest protests ever in the world up to that point. Perhaps they've been eclipsed since then by the climate change protests and by the current protests. But the point is, mere numbers and mere protests, well, just protesting, while it's very important, is not enough. And that's what the Iraq War demonstrated. And since then, in fact, that marked the collapse of the anti-war movement after the invasion, and after the protests were channeled, very deliberately channeled behind the Democratic Party in order to neuter them and to subordinate them to capitalist politicians. I mean, that killed the anti-war movement, not just in the US, but all over the world. So that the war in Afghanistan and Iraq continued for two decades and arguably still going on, but the anti-war movement disappeared.
Kia ora, Tom. Sorry, my name's Sol, and I'm just going to give some details on the Justice for Palestine events that are happening in Wellington right now. Yeah. There is a lot of groups that are organising, Palestinian groups and alternative Jewish voices that are happening in Wellington. There's also happening throughout New Zealand and throughout Australia as well. For Justice for Palestine, just to be really, really quick, there's an event happening tonight at 8:30, a projection and torchlight vigil for Palestine that's happening at Te Papa. I can also give out the links to anybody in the room that's interested in that. People will also be rallying on the first sitting day of Parliament. I think we've got to do all of the actions possible, including this long-term struggle for worker rights, but also the immediate actions right now for stopping what's happening in Palestine and the occupation. There's also further screenings happening this month. I'll link this to the site as well. But yeah, Justice for Palestine's really good to follow in Wellington. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Hi, sorry, my name's Pierre, and as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from New Zealand, I'm from London. Thank you so much for the information today. It's been really enlightening. I just wanted to ask a sort of similar question in terms of practical tips. I know in the talk you mentioned about protests not being enough. However, you're still mentioning that we need to be going to protest, but I just feel that's not actually addressing your original point of doing practical things day by day to stop this war. So I just want to kind of get to the actual meat of the debate, which is actually what can we do as individuals to help the Palestinian people around the world, and also people who are oppressed in other countries like Sudan and the Yemen. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the other questions that have come in. I just want to make some additional points to what Comrade Tom raised. I mean, the essential point that has to be grasped, and even the past month reveals it, is that the protests will not stop this horror. In fact, what we are seeing is that the response to the protests internationally has been to move further to the right, further towards barbarity. Each week, the horrors that are communicated are worse than the last. Well, each week, you hear stories, which you would think, you haven't really heard these type of horrors really recounted in this type of vivid detail, except in the history books of, periods like the Second World War, etc. It's not as Cheryl said earlier, that these crimes haven't existed before. But for them to be almost live streamed to our phones really reveals the true nature of the system that we're under. The real question, and the other point, just to make the point, is these protests. I mean, there are attempts more and more to illegalize them, to utilize, and this is why I went through in some detail the lie that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are in somehow linked. But the real problem, the essential problem, that is the question of capitalism. That's the issue. And the program and perspective, in that sense, that is put forward at the protests and that is put forward in different avenues, if they are not directed against the root cause of the problem, then ultimately the problem will not be resolved. So why we've emphasized this historical question of capitalism, the necessity for socialist revolution, is because the answer to this crisis is contained within that history, within the fight for international socialism. So in terms of immediate practical things, I mean, that's always the pressure. I know another questioner said, how does one deal with the horrors that you confront? And they're indeed horrible. There's no question. But to answer those horrors, one needs a program and perspective. And our analysis of the situation that confronts mankind is that the very same processes that are giving rise to war and the barbarity now seen in Gaza is giving rise to its opposite. That is the independent movement of masses of workers. Now, at the moment, the protests are dominated. I mean, there's workers and young people out there. But what these protests have to turn to is the revolutionary class in society. That is the working class. It has to be, turned to organise. And that means, as I think was communicated by Will Lehman, the development of strike action, the development of stopping the movement and shipment of boats, etc. And these have to occur. I mean, and the other aspect, and I think this is also critical, is one has to know who the enemies are. Just to make the sometimes obvious political point, your enemy, or that is the enemy of the program and perspective of revolution and changing society, which is the root cause of the problem, don't make themselves necessarily immediately known. There are experiences that even in the past few weeks one can turn to. In Australia, the Maritime Union of Australia, MUA, were part of what were called Trade Unionists for Palestine movement. They organised protests at various ports to protest what was, I think it was called the Zim ship from Docky, which was an Israeli ship that after the popular uprising on October 7th have given their full support for the Israeli war and genocide for the Israeli regime. Now, this protest, which did amass a significant support from layers of workers and young people at the protest itself, the MUA said, oh, well, we give our full support for it. But we, intervened into their meeting and asked what was, one has to say, the obvious question. Are you calling on workers to strike against this? Are you going to organise general strikes of workers? And the MUA is part of one of the largest unions in Australia, with somewhere in the vicinity of 100,000 workers, strike action against this. And the response to our question was to publicly, in that sense, in the meeting, denounce us for asking it, and, in a very aggressive atmosphere, escort us out of the meeting room. Well, what occurred then at the protest? Well, certainly, I mean, as I said, I'll emphasise the enthusiasm and direction of young people and workers that were there were certainly against, the docking of this ship. But the MUA were virtually not present. A couple of flags being waved. And then it becomes apparent that these Zim ships were not only docking in this one time, but have been in and out of the docks across Australia, of which the union bureaucracy would know. I think as Tom emphasised in his lecture, these bureaucracy, the union bureaucracy, are now playing a very direct role, not only in suppressing the class struggle, in organising sellout agreements, but also now in facilitating this genocide in Israel in one form or another. And so what is critical for workers, and if there are, people who are there, and I'm sure you have various areas and workplaces, that you work in, is the beginning of the formation of what we call rank and file committees of workers. These are not new unions. You cannot, in that sense, shift or change the union by changing its leadership or something. There needs to be new organs of struggle. And so that's what we call for, the formation of rank and file committees in workplaces. And that means, in the beginning of that process, certainly is a discussion with colleagues and those you work with, but also to get in touch with us. I mean, we support the formation of rank and file committees. We will assist in their development. But in all of this, the essential critical question is a study of history and a study of politics. There can't be a shortcut. There isn't a way to bypass that. One can't all join together, and there is one says, I think you said, maybe we vote National, maybe we vote Labor, but we're all on it. Well, there are definite programs that these political organizations have, and those programs have led to the situation that confronts the Palestinians now, including Ardern, as we've said, who've said absolutely nothing, and the Labor Party has fully supported this. So there needs to be a conscious break with these organizations. And above all, the fight taken up for a new political perspective, and that is international socialism based on, the history of the left opposition and the Fourth International. But I'll leave my comments there for now.
Thanks, Max. We can have others that continue to answer those questions. We have another, which is not from Jenny, but the question is, and it's a very good one, it's been said several times today that the major conflicts happening around the world at the moment, the US and its allies have been supporting and could lead to the beginning of World War III. I agree with this sentiment. My question is, besides protesting, which we can all agree won't get the desired results, what is the plan, if any, to actively fight capitalist leaders from creating these conflicts for financial gain? Look, I'll just make a couple of points on this while Max and Tom are gathering their thoughts. And it relates to the questions that have been raised previously. And again, very valid and understandable questions. We have a horror taking place in Gaza. What can we do to prevent it? I mean, first of all, in order to understand how to deal with what is taking place against the Palestinians, it's important to understand why it's happening. That certainly the fascistic nature of the Netanyahu government, of the Israeli government, is clear for all to see. But the question has to be asked, therefore, why does every other government, every single government on earth, to virtually without exclusion, also support what is taking place? It is because what is bound up with the forcing out of the Palestinians from Gaza, their expulsion onto the Sinai Desert. If they do not agree to this, they will be killed in their beds. This is bound up with the attempt by Israel to consolidate itself, to attempt to overcome its own internal crisis, of which there is profound numbers, and the fact that the largest demonstrations being carried out against Netanyahu took place in July and August of this year, and by Jewish people, against the dictatorial measures that the government was implementing, and that these dictatorial methods were going to be used against Jews themselves. Because Israel itself is an outpost, it is a proxy, it is a bulwark for imperialism within the Middle East against the Arab masses, but in particular in order to consolidate the supply of oil in the Middle East. And so Israel is carrying this through with the support of the Biden administration in order to ensure both Israeli but also US imperialism is able to re-establish its hegemony, which it has increasingly lost and is losing to China economically, in a sea of rivals, which is what exists. The war in Ukraine, which is only another front of what is, as we're saying, the developing conditions for World War III. The perspective of US imperialism and of NATO is to carry through the dismemberment, the overthrow and the dismemberment of the Russian Federation, and to win back the resources, the labor, the area which it lost in the Russian Revolution. This is not to say that Putin is a socialist or has defended nationalized property relations. They haven't. What they did was restore capitalism in 1991, and that then reprised the plan that US imperialism had since 1917, and that was to regain what it lost in the Russian Revolution. While capitalism was restored in 1991, it was not made available. The gains of that capitalist restoration were not made available to US imperialism. That's what the Ukraine war is all about. It's got nothing to do with the defense of Ukraine. And the plan, the perspective of US imperialism is to destroy Russia and then enable it to turn to what it really sees as its major enemy, its major rival, and that is China. So you have got now all the preparations being made. You've got war in the Middle East. You've got war in the worst war in Europe since 1945, and provocations and preparations for the war against China. This will not be overcome through protest. It will not be overcome by appealing to the same capitalist governments that are part and parcel of these plans. I mean, NATO, which involves virtually all of Europe, is bound up and is in fact funding and increasingly populating the armed forces within Ukraine. You have the Albanese government that is both, again, supporting the war against the Palestinians, funding because there's shipments which they have never revealed, defense shipments, with 213 of them, which have been undertaken, I think, since 2019, that have never been revealed what's in those shipments, those defense shipments, and they play a central role in the preparation for war against China. Now, what we are raising is these protests are profoundly important, but what they can lead to, unless they have a perspective, an anti-capitalist perspective, a perspective which is bound up with the fight for an alternative, for a socialist society, then those protest movements will end up in despair and disillusionment, as they did after the 2003 protests against the war in Iraq. There was a great deal, I mean, there were huge demonstrations in 2003. People thought that having so many on the streets, that governments would have to listen. The Howard government brushed them aside. Blair, Bush, all of them brushed those millions of people aside and carried through the destruction of an entire society and the death of 1 million people. Now, the same thing, only worse, will take place. Already there is discussion about the use of nuclear weapons. Israeli cultural minister, if we don't mind, is already saying, well, why can't we use nuclear weapons against Gaza? There is already discussion within the US administration about the use of nuclear weapons. What we're raising is that protest alone will not result in either the backing down of Israel, because every week Netanyahu's bombing actually accelerates. What is needed is the mobilization of the working class with the multi-million masses worldwide involved in these protests to fight for the blocking, the actual independent action of the working class, to block manufacturing of weapons, to block the handling, the shipping of these weaponry to Israel, and in so doing, then start to take on their own ruling class, which has aided and abetted what the US and Israel has carried out in Gaza. It's a big task, but it's a task which, unless it's carried out, will result in the end of the capacity of Earth to support life. I mean, whether it's climate change, whether it's war, whether it's COVID. I mean, already capitalists and capitalist governments have proven they are fine with death on a mass scale. 25 million people died of COVID completely unnecessarily. If they are willing to have that, why do we think that they will stop it at nuclear war? And so what we're saying is in order to understand what is necessary, then it is necessary, as Max said, to look at previous experiences that workers have gone through. This is not the first time that mass numbers of people have fought against their governments, but without a leadership, without a perspective, they will be defeated, as they have done before. And that's the issue that I think we really need to start looking at. We can discuss it, we can work through it, but really needs to be addressed. So I don't know whether Max or Tom want to add anything, or whether there's anybody online who wants to raise any points.
Just to comment very briefly, I endorse what Cheryl has just spoken about. I've posted an article in the Zoom chat that we published yesterday about the protest in London, which I think is very important and deals with a lot of these questions. The headline is "Over 800,000 March in London Against Gaza Massacre, but given no way forward by the march organisers." And that sort of sums up the issue, really, that we are raising here. That you have, on the one hand, a demonstration of the enormous power or potential power of the working class in the UK and internationally. But what do they get in terms of a political perspective, in terms of the speeches given by the organisers and who included Labour Party MPs and union leaders in Britain? Basically, write to your MP and sign petitions. And we make the point in that article, one of the speakers at this march was Jeremy Corbyn, who's really a political charlatan. His whole perspective is just to persuade Keir Starmer to somehow change his political stripes and cease to be a thoroughly rotten right-wing representative of the ruling class. Another speaker was Mick Lynch, the leader of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, who's, I think, regarded as a bit of a radical in Britain, but it's entirely illusory. I mean, he, as we say, that union, whose members play a very critical role in transport and logistics, has not done a single thing to organize the most basic anti-war actions, including the blocking of arms shipments and other material assistance to Netanyahu's regime of war criminals. And that's why I raised the example in my speech of Will Lehman, the socialist auto worker in the United States and supported by the Socialist Equality Party, who has campaigned for years, actually, among auto workers on the basis of a socialist and internationalist program, opposing the Democrats, opposing the sellouts of the trade union bureaucracy and the corruption of the union bureaucracy, and on that basis calling for rank and file auto workers to take matters into their own hands. And that is what we are calling for. There are practical things that workers can do, but and that can actually have a real impact on the course of this genocide to stop it from happening. And so, but workers need to be aware of that, and they need to be aware who they are up against politically. They're up against the Labour Party. They're up against the unions. These are not their friends. These are not the friends of the anti-war movement. And that's what we are trying to, the point we're trying to make at this meeting. There has to be a turn to the working class. Instead of appealing to the government to call for a ceasefire, which it won't do, or maybe it will, but it will be totally ineffectual and just, meaningless. But instead of appealing to these pro-war, pro-genocide governments, workers or protesters should be appealing to the working class to take action to actually stop this barbarism, including political strikes. As I said, the demand for an end to the alliance with the United States. None of this is to say that the protests are not important. They're extremely important and have to be supported, but they have to be broadened and they have to be given a political perspective that is viable and is not going to lead to defeat and despair. And ultimately, that requires the building of a real socialist leadership in the working class. The Socialist Party, which does not exist in New Zealand, but we are fighting to build it. So I'll leave my comments there.
Thanks, Tom. We have John Braddock, who is also a writer for the World Socialist website, who wants to make a few points.
Yes, I think it's a very important discussion. And I think, in a sense, the question about, how can we get the information, how can we find out what's going on, has been answered in the course of the meeting. I mean, we had almost immediately a contribution where almost a dozen events were read out. And I think, that's a characteristic of the period we're in. And I think, that the question arises that, what's necessary is to develop a consciousness of through what stage are we passing? What stage of political and historical development has the last 4 or 5 weeks shown us? The first thing is that this enormous international movement is an historic movement. We put forward some time ago now, following our analysis of the globalization of production, of politics and economics, the conception that the struggles of the working class in the coming decade would be international in form and in content. In other words, no longer were the struggles of the working class isolated by national boundaries. And in New Zealand, that's a particular issue. All of the strivings of the New Zealand ruling elite and its kind of parties in the sort of New Zealand sort of middle class left is to say that New Zealand is separate. New Zealand is a little kind of haven at the bottom of the South Pacific, that's separate from everything else. And it's part of the discussion about whether New Zealand has or can have an independent foreign policy. That's now blown to pieces. The last 5 weeks have shown that the stage that we are now passing through is one of international struggles involving millions of people, all at the same time. We follow them on the internet. The mainstream media doesn't look at it, but everybody else is. I think the second aspect of what we've seen over the last 5 weeks is that the genie of parliamentary politics is now out of the bottle. There is no going back to pretending that that these issues can be solved through appeals to Parliament. Comrades have made the point about the period being the direct interference of masses in historical events. That point is made by Trotsky actually in his History of the Russian Revolution. But the rest of that quote I think is very interesting, and if you'll just bear with me, I'll read it out. It says, "But at those crucial moments when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they break over the barriers, excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, and create by their own interference the initial groundwork of a new regime. Whether this is good or bad, we leave to the judgment of moralists. We ourselves will take the facts as they are given by the objective course of development. The history of a revolution is for us, first of all, the history of the forcible entrance of the masses into the realm of rulership over their own destiny." And I think that's what we're beginning to see now. But I think it's necessary to be clear about, who's putting forward what in these, demonstrations. Now, at the moment, two of the parties that have come forward to sort of be involved in supporting the Palestinians are the Greens and the Maori Party, Te Pāti Maori. Now, I think it's important to take, their involvement and their perspective with a grain of salt. I mean, had Labor had enough votes to form a government, the Greens and Te Pāti Maori would have gone into government with them. And very quickly, these two parties would have dropped their anti-war credentials and joined in whatever, New Zealand is an imperialist power. It has, military initiatives around the world, including in Europe. So these parties that are now, putting themselves forward in these protests would have very quickly gone into a Labor-led government and dropped all of that. One has to ask, what program are they putting forward? Well, as far as I'm aware, the Green Party supports the question of a two-state solution in the Middle East. Well, a two-state solution is completely unviable. A Palestinian state would be under the yoke of imperialism and under the yoke of whatever existed in Israel. Our program is for the unification of all of the masses across the Middle East, including the Israeli working class. And there is a working class in Israel. So, there are programs and there are political issues at stake in all of these protests. But the last thing that will now happen is a return to the parliamentary system, and we have to oppose any attempts to turn it back into appeals to Parliament, protests, that suggest that Parliament will resolve this. There is a well-known quote in the socialist movement that revolutions are made when ordinary people, when the masses cannot continue living in the same old way, and the ruling class cannot keep on ruling in the same old way. And we are certainly at that point now. And I think, the most straightforward answer to what can we practically do is I think has been suggested. We have to take matters, the working class has to take matters into its own hands in whatever way it can, using whatever tools are available. using its own organisations, but above all, its own party. A revolutionary leadership and its own party in this period is what's required. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Kevin has, before I hand over to Mike, Kevin has written again a very important point. He says, correct, the issue is capitalist greed and monopolisation, but what can actually be done? In Australia, with a two-party preferred system, even gaining large numbers of votes, the SEP will never have the control and influence it seeks. You say that we can support worker strikes, but with inflation at a current high and the cost of living almost impossible for those in the low and middle class, wouldn't this lead to a situation of cutting off our figurative noses to spite our face? My question still stands. What is the ultimate goal here? Not just for the current topic, but the SEP overall. When living in a two-party preferred democracy, what does the best achievable outcome look like? From the replies to the question asked, it looks like the real questions are being skirted around. Okay, I'll open up for Comrade Mike Head, who is also a very well-known writer for the World Socialist website and a long-standing leader of the party in Australia.
Well, thanks. Look, I speak only briefly because we're running out of time, but I agree very much with the points that the speakers have made. We're not skirting around the question. In fact, we're focusing on the real question. That is, the working class needs a revolutionary leadership. We have to overthrow this barbaric capitalist system on a global scale before it destroys human civilization. What you're seeing in Gaza is not just Gaza. This is the future that imperialism has for the masses everywhere. Anybody who comes up and fights and resists against their oppression, who seeks to break out of the straitjacket that they've been kept in for so long, this is the future which this imperialist system has. So, I mean, my short answer to the question actually would be join our party. Join our party and help us build a revolutionary leadership throughout the working class on a global scale that's up to the task of ending this system once and for all. The working class did it in Russia in 1917. That's what we've got to do on a global scale. And that means, of course, also understanding the lessons of history. Why and how did that revolution get betrayed? What was the fight of the left opposition led by Leon Trotsky against that betrayal, without which, none of the events we're now seeing would have taken place? That's the important thing that the speakers, I think, drew out. To understand what to do, you've got to understand how we got here. Zionism itself, wouldn't even exist as a mass movement or a substantial movement if not for the betrayals of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. Look, the working class has the power to paralyze not just Israel, but the global capitalist system itself. But the union bureaucrats and the parties that support them are sitting on the working class. And as comrades have said, the perspective today from London makes this very, very clear. You've got massive marches happening around the world, including in the major centres, but they're all being diverted into making a dead-end appeal to the existing governments to change their minds, change their course. It's not going to happen. We have to fight for the development of this movement on a revolutionary basis. And what's the solution in Palestine? As John just said, it's not a two-state solution. The solution is the unity of the Jewish and Arab working class of the entire region to abolish the Zionist state and establish a socialist federation throughout that region as part of a world federation. That's not some far off, impossible dream. It's not. These events themselves, as we say in the perspective, are a catalytic event. We're seeing masses being thrown forward, not just by what's happening in Gaza, but also what's happening on the whole danger of war, nuclear war, climate catastrophe, and the cost of living crisis itself. People can't live increasingly. So, but what's lacking, what's missing at this point is a revolutionary leadership. And that's what we've got to build. And I urge everybody, in this meeting to join our party and help us build that leadership. That's the critical question that can't be skirted around. I just put it that way.
Thanks, Mike. Look, the meeting and the questions have been very important. And if Kevin, and I notice Kevin's comments is that he feels that the answers, as he said, seem to lead to a fantasy of a socialist-led revolution. A peaceful revolution is impossible, and there is no way to fight a war against the armies of the US, its allies, and their resources. The issue that confronts the working class, there is no question, it is a difficult task. The task of overthrowing capitalism, yes, is a difficult task. The task of reforming capitalism is an impossible task. If there's anything that is impossible, it is to appeal to the capitalist system to develop a more humane, a peaceful system, even if they wanted to. And there is no question that possibly their first choice isn't war, but their best choice is war, because they have no other resolution. The crisis which confronts the capitalist system now is an existential crisis against each other and the contradictions of the system itself, of globalized production and the nation-state system, of the international productive forces and the private ownership of the means of production. These are the very inherent contradictions of capitalism which they can't resolve. And it will come, and it is coming, as it did in 1914, as it did in 1939. They were unable to avoid World War then, and they are even less capable of avoiding an international conflagration now. The issue which confronts the working class is the development of an alternative political perspective, a leadership which has the perspective of the fight for power by the working class, the overthrow of capitalism. The working class creates all value, all wealth. If workers understand that their interests lie in their own class, the international proletariat, and the development of a society which functions and is organized for production for all, for society, not for the profit of a tiny few, they will be able to overthrow and deal with any problem which emerges. And that's what we have to fight for. The alternative is world war. That will be inevitable. While capitalism exists, it's not a question of a peaceful revolution or non-peaceful. That will be determined by the response of the ruling class. The issue is, while capitalism exists, war is inevitable, and that's why it has to be overthrown. Most importantly, I would urge you to think seriously, very seriously, about developing a relationship with us, to have further discussions, and to seriously consider joining our movement in New Zealand and within Australia, and begin your role in the development of the World Party of Socialist Revolution. But I thank you very much for your input, your questions, your information, and your attendance. Thank you very much.